cible les responsables des actions illégales de la Russie, ainsi que 2 banques russes soutenues par l'État. De plus, on interdit aux Canadiens de faire des achats de la dette souveraine russe. Et il sera interdit de participer à toute transaction financière avec les soi-disant États indépendants de Donetsk et de Luhansk. On a également annoncé le déploiement de jusqu'à 460 membres supplémentaires des Forces armées canadiennes pour soutenir l'OTAN sous l'opération Réassurance afin de favoriser la paix et la sécurité en Europe. Today, in light of Russia's reckless and dangerous military strike, we are imposing further severe sanctions. These sanctions will target 58 individuals and entities, including members of the Russian elite and their family members, as well as the Wagner Group and major Russian banks, among others. We will also sanction members of the Russian Security Council, including the Defense Minister, the Finance Minister, and the Justice Minister. In addition, effective immediately, we are ceasing all export permits for Russia and cancelling existing permits. These sanctions are wide-reaching. They will impose severe costs on complicit Russian elites, and they will limit President Putin's ability to continue funding this unjustified invasion. Aujourd'hui, suite à la frappe militaire irresponsable et dangereuse de la Russie, on impose d'autres sanctions sévères. Ces sanctions ont une grande portée. Elles vont entraîner de grands coups aux élites russes ayant des liens de complicité et elles vont limiter la capacité du président Poutine à continuer de financer cette invasion injustifiée. Je veux être clair. L'attaque de la Russie contre l'Ukraine est aussi une attaque contre la démocratie, la loi internationale et la liberté. Make no mistake, Russia's attack on Ukraine is also an attack on democracy, on international law, on human rights, and on freedom. Russia's actions stand in direct opposition to the democratic principles that generations of Canadians have fought to protect. Democracies and democratic leaders everywhere must come together to defend these principles and stand firmly against authoritarianism. Russia must immediately cease all hostile actions against Ukraine and withdraw all military and proxy forces from the country. Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity must be respected, and the Ukrainian people, like all people, must be free to determine their own future. I want to be clear. Our quarrel is not with the people of Russia. It is with President Putin and Russian leadership that has enabled and supported this further invasion of Ukraine. La vérité, c'est que la Russie viole la souveraineté de l'Ukraine depuis des années. En 2014, elle a annexé illégalement la Crimée. Depuis, elle n'a jamais cessé de nuire à la démocratie en Ukraine. Et aujourd'hui, le président Poutine a ouvert un nouveau chapitre sombre de cette histoire en lançant une invasion à grande échelle. These are deeply disturbing times for the international community and for people everywhere who care about freedom and democracy. And while the eyes of the world are on leaders, we can never lose sight of the human cost of conflict. Innocent people, including children, are now facing violence and chaos. In these dark times, with you. For Canadians and permanent residents in Ukraine, your safety and security are now our top priority. We also want to make sure that you can get to safety. We've arranged for safe passage for you and your families at the land borders with Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Moldova. We are urgently issuing travel documents for affected Canadians, permanent residents, and their immediate family members. We're also prioritizing immigration applications for Ukrainians who want to come to Canada. And to ensure we can serve people as quickly as possible, today we are launching a new dedicated phone line for anyone at home or abroad with urgent Ukraine-related immigration questions. Aux Canadiens et aux résidents permanents du Canada qui se trouvent en Ukraine, votre santé et votre sécurité sont notre priorité absolue. On a pris des mesures pour que vous et votre famille puissiez traverser en toute sécurité les frontières avec la Pologne, la Slovaquie, la Hongrie, la Roumanie et la Moldavie. On délivre de toute urgence des documents de voyage aux Canadiens et aux résidents permanents touchés, ainsi qu'aux membres de leur famille immédiate. On traite aussi en priorité les demandes d'immigration provenant d'Ukrainiens qui souhaitent venir au Canada. Et pour être certain de pouvoir servir les gens le plus rapidement possible, on lance aujourd'hui une nouvelle ligne téléphonique spécialement conçue pour les gens qui sont ici ou à l'étranger, qui ont d'urgentes questions à poser sur l'immigration en lien avec l'Ukraine. Last night, I spoke with Ukrainian Canadians at the Ukrainian Canadian Congress board meeting. I told them that President Putin has underestimated the strength and unity of democratic allies and partners, and he has underestimated the strength and resolve of Ukrainian people. These are traits of Ukrainian Canadians, too. You have helped build this country. You are proud of your culture and your heritage, and you don't back down. Well, neither will Canada. Our support for Ukraine, for democracy and for human rights remains unwavering. Merci beaucoup. Je passe maintenant la parole à la vice-première ministre Chrystia Freeland.
Merci, Monsieur le Premier ministre, et bon après-midi. Quand nous nous sommes réveillés ce matin, le monde était différent. La Russie a lancé une attaque brutale et non provoquée contre l'Ukraine, un pays de plus de 40 millions d'habitants qui ne demande que la paix et la liberté. Today, we woke up to a changed world. Russia has launched a brutal and unprovoked attack on Ukraine, a country of more than 40 million people who have sought nothing but peace and freedom. The horrific human costs of this cruel invasion are the direct and personal responsibility of Vladimir Putin, who has chosen to invade a sovereign democracy and challenge the rules-based international order. History will judge President Putin as harshly as the world condemns him today. Today, he cements his place in the ranks of the reviled European dictators who caused such carnage in the 20th century. The response by Canada and our allies will be swift, and it will bite. This barbaric attack cannot and will not be allowed to succeed. To my own Ukrainian Canadian community, let me say this. Now is the time for us to be strong as we support our friends and family in Ukraine. Now is the time for us to remember «Ще не вмерла Україна». И моим друзьям в России я хочу сказать прямо и четко. Наша ссора не с российским народом, а с президентом Путиным и с теми, кто его окружают и поддерживают. С теми, кто сделал кровавый выбор атаковать суверенную демократическую страну. Canada understands what is at stake. We know that the people of Ukraine, in fighting for their lives, for their sovereignty, are fighting for us too. They are fighting for democracy, and we stand with them. Thank you very much. Et je passe maintenant la parole à ma collègue, la ministre des Affaires étrangères, Mélanie Joly.
Today is a dark day. Last night, Russia launched an unjustified attack on Ukraine. Over the past several months, we have said that Russia was positioning troops and equipment to invade Ukraine. Russia said that it was not, that there was nothing to worry about. Russia lied. We said that Russian military buildups along the border were continuing to grow. Russia said exercises were complete and it was withdrawing troops. This was a complete fabrication. Russia told us their military exercises in Belarus would end on the 20th of February. Today, Russian forces are invading Ukraine from the territory of Belarus. We said that Russia would fabricate a pretext for military intervention in Ukraine, and Russia has tried to do that repeatedly, although in no way convincingly. Russia argued that the Minsk agreements were to be the only roadmap to peace. This week, Vladimir Putin declared the Minsk process dead. For Russia, this was never any question of a diplomatic, there was never any question of a diplomatic solution or an honest conversation about security in Europe. That this was always about Russia taking control over Ukraine's sovereignty. Russia is solely responsible for this crisis. They have chosen deception, intimidation, and a manufactured crisis based on lies and false flag operations. Today, the Russian regime is challenging the world order that has kept us safe since the Second World War. Au cours des derniers mois, nous avons dit que la Russie mettait en place des troupes et des équipements pour envahir l'Ukraine. La Russie a dit que ce n'était pas le cas, qu'il n'avait pas lieu de s'inquiéter. La Russie a menti. Nous avons dit que le renforcement militaire, le russe, le long de la frontière ukrainienne continuait de croître. La Russie a dit qu'elle allait retirer ses troupes. C'était une pure invention. La Russie nous a dit que ses exercices militaires au Bélarus prendraient fin le 20 février. Aujourd'hui, ils envahissent l'Ukraine via le Bélarus. La Russie a affirmé que les accords de Minsk étaient le seul chemin vers la paix. Cette semaine, Vladimir Poutine a explicitement déclaré que le processus de Minsk était mort. La Russie a donc prouvé au monde entier la véritable nature du régime de Vladimir Poutine. Ils sont les seuls responsables de cette crise qu'ils ont créée par la désinformation, la manipulation et la mauvaise foi. Earlier today, I have been in touch with the office of President Zelensky, with the Deputy Prime Minister, Finance Minister, and the Foreign Minister of Ukraine. I have been in touch with many of my G7 counterparts and the Secretary General of NATO. We're united. Canada stands with Ukraine and its people. Alongside our allies and partners, we will ensure Russia's actions do not go unpunished. You have heard the Prime Minister. We will impose a strong package of new sanctions targeting all major banks, oligarchs, members of the National Council, including Minister of Defense Shoigu, Minister of Finance Sylvanov, and Minister of Justice Trichenko. Canada will also block exports to Russia that require permits. Existing permits will be cancelled and all applications will be denied. No aerospace, technology and mineral goods will be sent to Russia. Canada has one of the strongest package of sanctions being released today. And together with those from our allies, we're inflicting severe pain on the Russian regime and the Russian economy. We call on Russia to stop its attack immediately and to return to the path of dialogue and diplomacy. This madness has to stop. Comme vous l'avez entendu de la part du Premier ministre, nous imposons des nouvelles sanctions visant toutes les grandes banques russes, les oligarques qui font partie de la garde rapprochée du président Poutine, les membres du Conseil national, notamment le ministre de la Défense, des Finances et de la Justice. Le Canada bloquera également toutes les exportations vers la Russie qui nécessitent des permis. Les permis existants seront annulés et toutes les demandes seront refusées. Aucun bien lié au secteur de l'aérospatial, de la technologie ou encore des minéraux ne pourront être exportés vers la Russie. Le Canada a mis en place l'un des ensembles de sanctions les plus vigoureux et avec ceux de nos alliés, le but est d'affaiblir et d'ébranler le régime russe et son économie. I also spoke again this morning to Canada's ambassador to Ukraine. Our staff are now safely in Poland. As soon as we are able to ensure adequate delivery of services, they will return to Ukraine. Consular services remain available to Canadians in Ukraine. Information on how to reach Global Affairs can be found on our website and on my social media channels. Should there be a surge in demand for consular assistance, we are ready. Our teams in Ottawa, Warsaw, and major European cities are on standby to support. The safety and security of all Canadians is our highest priority. Canadians in Ukraine should shelter in place unless they are able to leave the country safely. I'd like to finish by expressing that I know that the pain we're inflicting on Russia does not compare to that being felt by the Ukrainian people today. You can be assured that Canada and the world is with you. J'aimerais conclure en disant que je comprends que les sanctions que nous imposons à la Russie ne sont pas comparables à la douleur que ressent le peuple ukrainien aujourd'hui. Soyez assurés que le Canada et le monde entier est avec vous aujourd'hui. Merci. I will now pass the floor to my colleague Anita Anand.
Bonjour tout le monde. Today is a devastating day for the Ukrainian people, for democratic societies, and for all those who stand for peace and security. Indeed, some in the West have taken peace and security for granted before today. Some may have believed that what is happening right now in Ukraine, in Europe, could not, would not take place. But it is. Putin has chosen to deliberately invade Ukraine, a sovereign, democratic nation that did nothing to warrant this aggression. I am sure many of us could not even imagine what it must have felt like being woken up by explosions. Aujourd'hui est un jour dévastateur pour le peuple ukrainien, pour les sociétés démocratiques et pour tous qui défendent la paix et la sécurité. Poutine a choisi d'envahir délibérément l'Ukraine, une nation souveraine et démocratique, qui n'a rien fait pour justifier cette agression. When I visited Ukraine last month, I met with countless hard-working and good people, and I am heartbroken now to know that those same people are fighting for their futures, for their very right to exist as a sovereign people. And to my Ukrainian counterpart, my friend, Minister Resnikov, whom I saw only a few days ago and with whom I am in daily touch, and to all Canadians I say, I am with you, we are with you, Canada is with you. I offer my condolences to the families of the Ukrainians who have been brutally killed, and I wish a speedy recovery to the injured. My thoughts are also with the 1.3 million Ukrainian Canadians watching these unfolding events in horror. Let's be clear. Putin is responsible for these needless deaths, for violating the UN Charter, and for violating the international rules-based order at the same time. And comme Mélanie a déjà dit, in the last few weeks, Putin has tried to convince the world that the path that he has chosen is reasonable and legitimate, mais ce n'est pas le cas, pas du tout. Putin's actions are not only illegal, they are unconscionable. He has flagrantly disregarded the fundamental rights of Ukrainians to peace, freedom, and self-determination. Since 2014, in fact, Russia has set the stage for this unprovoked invasion, indeed further invasion of Ukraine, for this unwarranted attack on a sovereign people, for this deliberate undermining of the rules-based international order. And there are no arguments that Putin can put forward that could legitimize the choices that he has made. We will not stand for this attack on the rules-based international order. Notre détermination à faire respecter cet ordre international fondé sur les règles et à soutenir la sécurité de l'Ukraine, de l'Europe et du monde est inébranlable. Since the very beginning, when Crimea was invaded in 2014, Canada has been there with Ukraine and all those under threat from Russia's actions. I want to outline 5 points. First, we've been there with strong and coordinated economic sanctions, which will continue to weaken Russia. Second, by putting in place then extending and expanding Operation Unifier. Under this mission, our Canadian Armed Forces have trained more than 35,000 of their Ukrainian counterparts to help them defend themselves against an eventuality like this one. We have watched Ukraine's soldiers become a more disciplined, more agile, and more effective fighting force. And as soon as conditions allow, we will continue to provide training and capacity building to the Ukrainian military under Operation Unifier. We have also been providing support from a cyber perspective and will continue to do so. Third, by providing significant financial contributions to strengthen Ukraine's institutions and economy, approximately $700 million in total. Fourth, by providing nearly $10 million worth of lethal and non-lethal equipment, which has arrived in full and in time to be effective and useful. Fifth, and finally, by announcing this week the expansion of Operation Reassurance to bolster NATO's eastern flank and to make it clear to Putin that we stand with our allies and our partners in the face of Russian aggression and destabilization efforts. We have also placed 3,400 military personnel across all branches of the service on standby to deploy to the NATO response force should they be required. We have constantly demonstrated, in short, our support for our allies and our partners in the face of authoritarianism and such aggression. I want to personally thank our Canadian Armed Forces for the critical work that they have done to prepare our Ukrainian friends for this fight. In the coming days, months, and years, your country will continue to ask more of you. Given the increasingly dangerous world, just made significantly more dangerous, your service is more important than ever. And I will do everything in my power to ensure that you are resourced to fight and win. And I can confirm that Canadian Armed Forces are ready to assist with the whole of government efforts in the region. Finally, I will remain in close contact with our NATO allies, our Ukrainian partners, and with Minister Resnikov. We cannot allow Putin to redraw maps and to rewrite history to suit his own purposes. We must and we will stand up against these efforts to sow discord, deceit, and violence. Nous ne pouvons pas permettre à Poutine de redessiner les cartes et de décrire l'histoire pour servir ses propres objectifs. En cette période critique pour l'Ukraine, pour l'Europe et pour le monde, le Canada et ses alliés de l'OTAN sont plus unis, plus résolus et plus forts que jamais. Thank you. Merci. Miigwech.
Thank you, Minister Anand. We will be taking 20 minutes of questions, starting with the room. One question, one follow-up, then we'll go to the phone. On va prendre 20 minutes de questions, en commençant avec les journalistes dans la salle. Et on va aller au téléphone. Une question, une sous-question, en commençant avec the Canadian Press.
Prime Minister Laura Osmond with the Canadian Press. Given everything you and your ministers have just said, is the West at war and is Canada prepared to fight in it?
We condemn unequivocally this attack on Ukraine, this invasion of Ukraine, but also the violation of the UN Charter, the principles, the rule of law internationally, and we will respond forcefully to make sure that Russia fails, that Russia does not benefit from having invaded Ukraine. We've demonstrated, not just with Canada's response and sanctions, but with the unity that we've seen amongst G7, amongst NATO leaders, amongst EU leaders, and indeed amongst leaders from around the world, that what Russia is doing is terrible and wrong and will be met firmly and forcefully with a response that will punish Russia and make sure they understand that this was a grave misunderstanding of the rules-based order and a grave miscalculation by Vladimir Putin.
And perhaps for Minister Freeland, I'd just love to ask you, is this the end of the post-World War II order as we know it? And certainly the Ukrainian ambassador believes so. And what does that mean for Canada moving forward?
Thank you for the question. It's a really important one. And the reason that we are so determined today, the reason you heard such determination from the Prime Minister and my ministerial colleagues today, is we cannot allow this to be the end of the post-World War II rules-based order. It could be. This is an extremely serious challenge to that order. And if Russia succeeds, then that order will be breached. And we can't let that happen. We can't let that happen because that would be devastating for the world. And it would be really bad for Canada. Canada was one of the countries that built the rules-based international order after the Second World War. Canadians fought and died to build that order. And they did that because they cared about the world, but they also did it because they understood that as a middle power, as a democracy, we really need those rules to be firmly in place. So yes, it is a moment of grave danger. And that's why when all of us said today that the people of Ukraine are fighting for their own democracy and their own sovereignty, but they're fighting for all of us. And that's why we need to support them.
Next question.
Yasmine Mehdi avec Radio-Canada. Il y a 2 jours, vous nous annonciez des sanctions, une première vague de sanctions. Ça n'a pas arrêté Vladimir Poutine. Est-ce qu'on pense vraiment que plus de sanctions vont changer quelque chose ou est-ce qu'on est face à un acteur irrationnel devant lequel les sanctions ne changeront absolument rien?
On a vu à quel point c'est important pour Poutine de justifier en utilisant des mensonges et de la propagande ses actions auprès de sa propre population russe. Depuis plusieurs semaines, même plusieurs années, il contrôle les médias, il utilise énormément d'outils de propagande pour convaincre les Russes d'une justification fausse pour leurs actions, pour la menace, la soi-disant menace que présentait l'Ukraine. La Russie a besoin, même si c'est une autocratie et non une démocratie, Poutine a besoin de l'expliquer que c'est dans l'intérêt de sa population d'agir de façon injustifiée, injustifiable contre l'Ukraine. Et les sanctions, et pas juste les sanctions, mais l'unité qu'on est en train de démontrer par rapport à ces actions au niveau du G7, au niveau de l'OTAN, au niveau de l'Europe, au niveau de pays dans le monde qui condamnent cette action qui s'est passée en Ukraine, mais qui aurait pu se passer n'importe où ailleurs, va rendre ça extrêmement coûteux pour l'économie russe, pour l'État et les dirigeants russes, mais aussi pour tous ceux qui les appuient. On sait que ça va faire vraiment mal à des gens qui vont demander de meilleures réponses et de meilleures explications à Poutine qui ne peut pas en offrir parce que c'est totalement injustifié, injustifiable, ce qu'il a fait en envahissant un pays souverain.
Je comprends, mais ça ne répond pas tout à fait à la question de est-ce que ça va changer quelque chose? Vous le traitez de dictateur, vous disiez qu'il est de mauvaise foi, que c'est un menteur. Est-ce que des sanctions, ça change quelque chose? Et aussi, est-ce qu'il y a un contexte où on irait plus loin en envoyant, par exemple, l'armée canadienne peut-être même se battre aux côtés des Ukrainiens?
On sait très bien que ça va avoir un impact sur la Russie. Ces sanctions, pas juste par le Canada, mais par les pays européens, les États-Unis, la Grande-Bretagne et d'autres pays alliés à travers le monde, qui se rassemblent pour dire très clairement, on ne le prend pas. On n'accepte pas que Vladimir Poutine choisisse de faire fi, de bafouer complètement les règles qui nous ont gardés sains et saufs et stables en tant que monde depuis plus de 75 ans. Ce n'est pas juste une attaque contre l'intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine, c'est une attaque contre les principes démocratiques que nous avions bien établis, les règles du jeu aux Nations unies, qui nous mettent tous en danger. Et c'est pour ça que le monde entier est en train de réagir fermement pour s'assurer que Poutine échoue dans son essai de tirer quelque avantage pour sa propre gloire personnelle et pour la Russie.
Prochaine question.
Hi, Prime Minister. Tom Perry, CBC. Can you provide more detail in terms of the sanctions you're bringing in today? The ones that, targeted at individuals, are you freezing assets? Are you seizing assets? And on the export permits, what's that worth? And if I could put a third part in, the Premier of Alberta is talking about a global ban on Russian oil and gas imports. What would you think about that?
These are all conversations that we've been having throughout the past weeks amongst our allies. We know that Russia is a significant source of natural gas and oil for European partners. And one of the things that we've been doing over the past number of weeks is ensuring that there are alternatives to Russia, not just to make sure that our friends and allies in Europe continue to be able to function their economies and support their people, but to make sure that Putin no longer draws sustenance for his economy from selling those products around the world. In regards to sanctions, any individual country can only have so much of an impact, particularly Canada, that doesn't have huge trade with Russia, to be honest. Since Crimea in 2014, we have significantly decreased our interactions with Russia. But the cumulative impact of the unity in I'll turn to Minister Joly.
Thank you. So in response to your question regarding permits, we're canceling all already issued permits and pending permits. Hundreds of permits are now being canceled, and it is worth more than $700 million. It includes companies in the aerospace sector. It includes companies that are in the technology, IT sector. It includes also technologies that are in the minerals sector. These companies need to have permits to send their goods to Russia. And so that's why this is how we as a government can really have a strong impact. If I may go back to your question that you asked about the impact of the international rule-based order, I think that Canada, the world needed Canada after the Second World War, and the Deputy Prime Minister explained it very well. I think that now the world needs even more Canada, because it is important that we reach out, yes, to the G7, yes, to countries within the NATO alliance, but also countries that are preoccupied with their own sovereignty and territorial integrity across South America, across Africa, across the Gulf, and across Asia. And that's what we'll be doing in the coming days. Thank you.
Next question.
Prime Minister, I asked you a version of this earlier this week about the effectiveness of sanctions. And it seems to me that sanctions are designed to get a response from a rational actor. And I'm wondering if you think Vladimir Putin at this time is a rational actor.
I think Vladimir Putin has come to believe that he can lie with impunity, that he can violate international law with impunity, and that he can do whatever he wants in the interests of the Russian state. And what we are demonstrating with this strong, united response is that is simply not true. That democracies can and will push back against autocracies. That we will demonstrate that we can follow up to defend the values and the principles that we, and indeed people around the world, hold dear: of freedom, of respect for the rule of law, of human rights. And sanctions work. We've seen it, our ambassador to the United Nations brought up the example of sanctions against apartheid South Africa in the 80s that ended up bringing about an end to that regime and that approach. Yes, we will continue to demonstrate that those who violate the rules-based international order don't get to benefit from the trade, the opportunities, the economic growth that comes with a stable, clear, international rules-based order.
Prochaine question.
Of course, Christian.
I'd just like to add one thing about the impact of these targeted sanctions and about Russia. I think it is so important, as we see the Kremlin order this truly barbaric act, to be very clear that our fight, our opposition, our fierce criticism is not of the Russian people. And in fact, Russia has such an amazing, rich intellectual tradition, such an amazing intelligentsia. And there have already been Russian intellectuals, Russian journalists, Russian writers speaking out and saying how terrible, how vile this action is. That takes real courage, and we have to hear those voices too. One of my Russian friends, a Russian economist who actually worked in the government, saying now he knows how it felt to be a good German in 1939. And there are people in Russia who feel that way, and it's important for us to see them too. And when it comes to the sanctions, Melanie and her colleagues have done a very good job at targeting the people who have been Putin's fellow travelers, people who have been able to become extremely rich, enjoy all of the pleasures of the West, of Western democracies, while aiding and abetting Vladimir Putin. And what these united sanctions from the West are saying to those people, to the Russian oligarchs, is you're not going to be able to keep on doing that. You are not going to be able to be a high roller, enjoying all of the fantastic things which Western democracy has created, and continue to support this evil, barbaric policy. And I believe that that will have a real impact.
Bonjour, M. Trudeau. Olivier Ferrand-Boissé de TVA. Le président Poutine a indiqué que quiconque tenterait d'interférer à l'opération s'exposerait à une réponse de la Russie immédiate et conduira à des conséquences que vous n'avez encore jamais connues. Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire selon vous? Est-ce que vous craignez cette menace-là? Est-ce que ça pourrait aussi expliquer que, faire en sorte que vous évitiez de contribuer à une réponse militaire plus musclée?
On a contribué à la réponse militaire avec des armements qu'on a envoyés qui sont présentement dans les mains de l'armée ukrainienne pour se défendre contre cette invasion russe. Et par rapport aux menaces de la Russie et de Vladimir Poutine, nous restons solidaires, les leaders du G7, les leaders de l'Europe, les pays de l'OTAN. Et nous allons être sans équivoque dans notre solidarité, pas seulement avec l'Ukraine, mais avec les principes de règles de droit qui nous protègent tous à l'international. C'est une violation profonde des règles qui nous ont gardés en paix depuis plus de 75 ans et nous nous devons de se tenir fermement debout pour démontrer que Vladimir Poutine ne profitera pas de cette invasion d'un autre pays souverain.
Prochaine question.
Thanks, Prime Minister. Kristina Achkate, CTV National News. Would you be willing to fast-track Ukrainians to Canada? And how soon and how many Ukrainians? And will you try to avoid a similar incident with what we saw in Afghanistan with people trying to flee to Canada there and many were unable to get here?
We have worked over the past many weeks to prepare exactly for such eventualities. And as I mentioned in my prepared remarks, we are facilitating the crossing of Canadians and permanent residents into neighboring countries. We are emitting rapid travel documentation for those who need it. We're providing support for Canadians in Ukraine. We are there to accelerate visa applications and extensions for Ukrainians in Canada right now. We are going to use all those tools to make sure that Canada continues to be a good friend to the Ukrainian people, even as they suffer through this horrific and unjustified attack.
Next question.
Hi, Prime Minister. Mercedes Stevenson, Global News. I'm wondering why you haven't chosen to sanction Vladimir Putin directly. Muammar Gaddafi did suffer that fate, and you're talking about making Mr. Putin feel the consequences of his actions, but you haven't chosen to target him directly. Why is that? And is it because you're concerned about the threats he has made on anyone who will do that and the possible implications for Canadian security and the Canadian economy?
The key thing on sanctions has been to come forward in a coordinated way with all our allies, and that is the unity that is most damaging to the Kremlin and to Vladimir Putin, that we are all unequivocal and united on this. But for further comments on sanctions, I'll turn to Minister Joly.
Thank you, Mr. Rees. Today is a first important package of sanctions. There will be other sanctions coming. And that's important for the Canadian public to understand, because we want to make sure to put maximum pressure on Vladimir Putin's regime and also on the Russian economy. To do that, we need to do the work with our allies. We will continue to work with them, and we will really make sure that we're coordinated in locksteps. It is important for us to act as one. We don't want to create any form of loopholes. We want to make sure that our unity continues to be our strength. Thank you. Donc aujourd'hui, c'est un premier ensemble de sanctions très important, un des ensembles de sanctions les plus importants de tous nos alliés. Mais ce n'est que le début. Il va y avoir d'autres sanctions. À chaque fois que nous allons annoncer d'autres sanctions, nous allons le faire de façon coordonnée avec nos alliés. L'objectif est bien entendu d'être unis. Unis pourquoi? Parce qu'on doit s'assurer qu'il n'y a pas, en fait, de façon pour les personnes qui font partie de la garde rapprochée de Poutine, qui font partie de cette influence qu'exerce le régime russe sur sa population, mais en fait que ces personnes-là ne puissent pas avoir droit d'échappatoire. Et donc, dans les circonstances, on va travailler avec nos alliés du G7, avec nos alliés aussi au sein de l'Alliance de l'OTAN et tout autre allié. Merci.
Merci. On va maintenant passer au téléphone. Opérateur, c'est à vous.
Thank you. Merci. The first question will be from Justin Ling, freelance. Please go ahead. Your line is open.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister. In the last 12 hours, we've seen a considerable amount of success from the Ukrainians in shooting down Russian aircraft. They've done that thanks largely to surface-to-air missiles given to them by their Baltic allies. They've been requesting this sort of equipment from the West, from Canada specifically. Are we considering purchasing any kind of Stinger or Manpad missiles that could be given to the Ukrainian army?
Thank you, Justin. As you know, we've successfully delivered 2 shipments of lethal aid on top of military equipment that we sent a number of weeks ago. We continue to look at more and further ways to support the Ukrainian military in their brave stand against the Russian invaders. We continue to exchange with allies and coordinate to make sure that we're getting the Ukrainian military the tools that they need. But on further elements on that, I'm happy to turn to Minister Anand.
When I was in Ukraine, in Kyiv, a few weeks ago, I sat down with Minister Resnikov, and we had at least an hour and a half conversation about this very topic. We spoke in detail about the types of aid that Ukraine needed and the types of aid that Canada had in inventory to provide. And what we have done is to provide almost $10 million in lethal and non-lethal aid at the current time. Your question, of course, is what, in addition, can we do as a country? And Canadians, that our government is examining Ukraine. It would be imprudent to describe those options at the current time, but as soon as we have more to tell, we will do so. Thank you.
Following up?
Yeah, clearly we're continuing to follow these ramping up of sanctions. I'm wondering if you can preview what other sort of diplomatic or economic or even cultural pressures Canada can exert. Obviously, there's conversations about recalling ambassadors. Some European countries have moved to take Russian propaganda outlet RT off the air. And there are conversations about how to identify and potentially freeze and seize the assets of oligarchs who support Mr. Putin's regime. Can you give some detail about what that could look like in the coming days and weeks in Canada?
Well, these actually are all elements that we discussed this morning amongst G7 leaders and indeed have been the topic of conversation between our ministers and their counterparts and allies around the world for many, many days now. We are announcing today a extremely strong, unprecedented series of sanctions because of Russia's illegal invasion into Ukraine. But as was pointed out, we will continue to look for more and further ways to work in a coordinated, concerted fashion, and not just European countries and NATO members like Canada and the United States, but other partners around the world who are also expressing very real concern that if Vladimir Putin succeeds and benefits from this illegal and unjustifiable invasion of a neighboring country, then all are at risk. And we have undone the incredibly hard work of generations to establish a set of rules in our international order that have benefited us all and allowed for unprecedented peace and stability around the world, despite the very many challenges we face.
Thank you. Operator, we'll take one last question on the phone.
Thank you. Merci. Et la prochaine question va être de Mélanie Marquis, La Presse. À vous la parole.
Bonjour, ma question est pour M. Trudeau. La première, en fait, je reviens sur justement la toute première question qui a été posée. Est-ce que le Canada est en guerre? Votre ministre, Mme Anand, a dit que les troupes étaient prêtes, qu'il y avait l'appui du gouvernement. Qu'est-ce qui donnerait le signal que là, il faut envoyer des troupes sur le terrain? On n'a pas à le faire en Ukraine parce que l'Ukraine n'est pas membre de l'OTAN, mais ça passerait par quoi? Est-ce qu'il faut une résolution de l'ONU? Est-ce que le Canada appuierait une intervention militaire? Je m'excuse pour les 1001 questions.
Non, c'est de très bonnes questions, Mélanie, parce que tout le monde... La meilleure façon pour nous de démontrer une grave erreur en violant les principes de droit qui nous régissent comme monde depuis bien des décennies, c'est en s'assurant qu'ils ne profitent pas, qu'ils ne bénéficient pas de cette erreur monumentale qu'il a faite en envahissant un pays souverain. Alors, oui, on est là pour appuyer avec des armements et de l'aide militaire et économique l'Ukraine. On est aussi là pour renforcer nos partenaires de l'OTAN, pour démontrer que nous sommes une alliance qui répondra et qui se défendra s'il y a une attaque contre un des membres. Mais en même temps, nous sommes en train de démontrer que les démocraties qui défendent la règle de droit international ne vont pas hésiter pour répondre de façon ferme et réelle à quiconque, comme Poutine l'a fait, violerait les principes qui nous gardent en sécurité depuis des décennies.
En suivi?
Oui, le suivi pour Mme Joly. Vous avez rencontré l'ambassadeur russe un peu plus tôt aujourd'hui. Pouvez-vous d'abord juste nous faire un petit compte-rendu de la rencontre, mais aussi nous dire si vous en êtes rendu à envisager son expulsion à l'ambassadeur ou encore le rappel de l'ambassadrice du Canada qui est en poste à Moscou?
Merci, Mélanie. J'ai eu l'occasion de parler à notre ambassadrice à Moscou un peu plus tôt aujourd'hui pour faire le point sur la question, avoir de l'information sur l'état des lieux à Moscou et en Russie au moment où on se parle. C'est important, bien entendu, qu'on ait accès à cette information-là et nous sommes en contact avec elle. Mais je suis également en contact avec mes collègues ministres des Affaires étrangères du G7 pour qu'on soit coordonnés dans notre réponse au niveau diplomatique. Premier point. Deuxième point, j'ai eu l'occasion de rencontrer l'ambassadeur russe. Je lui ai expliqué fermement, droit dans les yeux, exactement quelle était la position du gouvernement du Canada par rapport à l'invasion de l'Ukraine par la Russie. Et donc, le message a été bien compris. Et puis, nous allons continuer de monitorer la situation. Mais vous devez comprendre, bien entendu, que le lien de confiance entre le Canada et la Russie est rompu au moment où on se parle. Je pense que ma collègue Anita Anand avait quelque chose à ajouter à ta question, Mélanie. Alors, je lui cède la parole.
Bonjour, Mélanie. Au sujet de nos missions, je voudrais être claire. Ce sont des missions pour la formation, ça c'est pour unifier, et pour réassurance, ça c'est pour la dissuasion. Ce n'est pas des missions pour le combat. Et comme le secrétaire général de l'OTAN a dit ce matin, ça c'est le cas. Nous n'avons pas les missions pour le combat et ça doit être clair pour notre pays et pour notre force armée canadienne aussi. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. C'est ce qui met fin à la conférence de presse d'aujourd'hui. This is what ends today's press conference. Thank you all.